Mr. Secretary, thank you so much for taking the time to join us here. Got to start asking you, the Trump administration in its closing days said there were some countries that were very, very close to joining the Abraham Accords, which will likely be the longest lasting and most effective foreign policy of the Trump administration. Can you give us any insight as to who may have been at the front or near the front of the line to join and whether they still might cross that line in the coming months or years?
Well, thank you for having me on today. I can't share anything that we were working on, but suffice it to say, we were working in countries all across the Middle East. We were working with countries in Africa. We were working with Islamic countries in Asia as well. We were working all across the world to help, frankly, to help Israel, to help those countries bridge any gaps that they have and make the case for why the right thing to do was to join the Abraham Accords or something like it, something which allowed those countries to recognize Israel as an economic partner, a security partner, a diplomatic partner. I'm very confident that the direction of travel is right. These accords were indeed historic, as you described them. And I hope that the American administration that's now in power will continue to put forth a series of policies from the United States, which won't be an impediment to these countries connecting with Israel. Those are important understandings. They were central to our thesis about how to create stability in the Middle East. And they were really important to recognizing Israel as the rightful homeland of the Jewish people and its right to defend itself.
Well, let's talk about that. So far, we've seen the Biden administration and your successor at the State, Tony Blinken, take off the foreign terrorist organization designation from the Houthi rebels. We've seen them attempt to re-engage with Iran now, also confronting the Saudis about their actions. So obviously a change of tone, which we fully expected. What is your early assessment of the Biden administration in terms of its foreign policy in the Middle East? And are there any areas of agreement thus far between you and them?
Well, I think we have shared objectives, but they go about it in a fundamentally different way. And they have a different hypothesis. Their hypothesis is always, and I say this, the Obama administration's was, and it looks like the Biden administration's too. Their hypothesis is that somehow the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians is a veto. Until that is resolved, that nothing can happen. We proved that wrong. We proved that, in fact, we're happy to continue to work to make lives of the Palestinian people better. That's what good things. Everyone wants that. But we're not going to allow the Palestinian Authority to continue to conduct its terror campaign, to continue to undermine any hopes for peace, and just frankly say no to everything. And so we went about building out stability in the region, creating partnerships and alliances. And when you take an approach that is different, when you say, no, we're going to give them the veto, and then we are ultimately going to go enter into some form of agreement with the world's largest state sponsor of terror, the regime in Iran, then that presents real risk. It presents risk to the region, and then countries in that region will feel compelled to act differently with respect not only to their relationship with the United States, but their relationship with each other and with Israel.
Your maximum pressure campaign on the Iranian regime bent them, but it did not break them in the end, at least not during your tenure in office and during the Trump administration. Meanwhile, America went at it alone, essentially, without the backing of the international community, at least publicly. Is there any other track you might take looking back on it now that you might have done differently to garner broader international support for hammering the Iranian regime?
We isolated the Iranian regime like no country ever had. We built out an enormous coalition of countries that understood Iran as the central threat to stability and peace in the Middle East. It is unfortunate that we couldn't bring the E3 along. They were so deeply wedded to this thing, this monstrosity called the JCPOA, which created a clear path for a nuclear weapons program for the Iranian regime. They were so deeply wedded to that, as it appears this administration is now as well, that we weren't able to bring them alongside. I regret that, but I wouldn't do anything different. We got it right. We put enormous pressure on the Iranian regime. That denied money for Hezbollah. It denied resources to Assad. Remember, during the Obama administration, the Iranian support for the Syrian government forced 6 million people to flee Syria. People forget about the enormous humanitarian crisis created by the Iranians, connected to a central understanding that the Obama administration had, which is that we're not going to push Iran at all. We're going to let them do what they will so that we can sign a piece of paper. It was a poor policy. I hope that this administration will see that today isn't 2015 and that the Iranian regime is under enormous pressure their people. The people of Iran understand that their leadership is failing them. Continuing down the path that our administration had begun would lead to a really good outcome for the Iranian people and a much more stable and a much more secure Middle East.
We saw during the Trump administration and during your time leading the State Department something that was fairly unprecedented, I think, in that evangelical Christians in America combining with pro-Israel American Jews and seemingly pushing the Israeli government's policy for the first time, actually rightward instead of trying to pull them back leftward. Do you agree with that assessment?
I don't know that we were pushing Israeli politics one way or the other. We were focused on our mission set, which was to create security for the American people and to be good partners with the Israeli government, whoever that government might have been. We ended up having a partner in Prime Minister Netanyahu who was a fantastic partner to work with, who understood the central threats to his country, was prepared to defend them, was prepared to work alongside the United States to help achieve them, and indeed make sacrifices to agree to the Abraham Accords themselves. We sometimes forget that Israel had to sign up for these deals as well and had to make agreements and commitments about the things that they would do and would not do in order to enter into those agreements. This is what deals are about. This is how compromise occurs. It's how stability is engendered. And to undermine that, I'm watching this administration now look like they may go underwrite the Palestinian Authority again. We said that's crazy, right? To underwrite the Palestinian Authority while they are threatening Israel and they refuse to sign up for a deal to send American taxpayer money there is not only immoral, but it violates the Taylor Force Act, right? It violates U.S. law where the Palestinians are doing, pay for slay. It's essentially, if the administration heads back to that, if the administration sees that, we're going to underwrite the Palestinian Authority, it's as if they're laundering money through the Palestinian Authority to try and get to some better deal. It won't happen. It won't increase the likelihood that the Palestinian Authority will come to the negotiating table. Rather, a clear understanding that here are the commitments a country needs to make. We saw multiple countries do that. If the Palestinian leadership is prepared to negotiate an arrangement which provides security for Israel, I am confident that the lives of the Palestinian people would be far, far better than they are today.
Speaking of that, Palestinian elections apparently are right around the corner. Assuming they happen, what do you see as the future of Palestinian leadership and where the Palestinian Authority and its citizens head from here?
Well, there's no indication that this election will be anything more than a rubber stamp for the current leadership. I hope I end up being wrong about that. I hope I'm surprised. But more importantly, the Palestinian people should demand that they have real elections where they elect leadership that will fundamentally understand that they can't just be no, no, no. They have to get to an outcome. They're going to have to adjust and make a set of decisions which will secure their long-term prosperity. You'll recall our efforts in the Middle East began with laying out our vision for peace that included an enormous amount of resources flowing to the Palestinian people, which would have made their lives so much better. Look, I regret that the Palestinian leadership couldn't see their way to that. I don't see these elections as being likely to change that much at all.
The Israeli government, it certainly appears whether Netanyahu prevails in the next election or not, will be a government led by the right. It's dealing with a Democratic president, with a Democratic House, with a Democratic Senate. One of the criticisms against you and the Trump administration was turning Israel into a quote unquote political football. Critics cited your virtual appearance at the Republican National Convention from Jerusalem while on a trip to Israel representing the State Department. Did that concern you at all during that time, that you were kind of mixing those two things together and it might have some long-term repercussions for the Israeli government?
No, I regret that somehow a group of Democrats had concluded that the appropriate partnership and permitting Israel to defend itself was not in their political best interest. This change, this transformation that took place within the Democrat Party is something that I don't think is good for the United States of America. That, for me, is the most important thing. I know it's not good for relationships between the United States and Israel. For many decades, it had been largely bipartisan. But you have radical progressives inside the U.S. Democrat Party who, frankly, are so pro-Palestinian that they can't see that, in fact, the policies that they are seeking, the policies they would like to see happen, will grossly work to the detriment of the people for the Palestinian people. I mean, they want to have these conversations and negotiations, and yet You have Hamas launching rockets into Israel. We often think of just the West Bank, but remember this problem set is much more complicated than just that. Look, my remarks from Jerusalem that night to the RNC are something I'm really proud of. It was important for me to talk about American foreign policy during our administration and why it mattered and why I believed it was the best thing for the United States of America. That's not what turned America's progressive Jewish left against Israel and why it has caused them to take positions that are antithetical to Israel being able to simply do the right thing and defend itself.
One of the main focuses of your tenure as Secretary of State was China. And it appeared that one of the few points of tension between the United States and Israel was Israel's dealings with China financially in terms of investment in infrastructure and sensitive communications matters. How did you advise the Israeli government to kind of toe that line and tread lightly when it came to dealing with China, which has become such an immensely important trading and investment partner with Israel?
So that's a good question. Look, China is an important trading partner for many countries around the world. And I spent my time traveling the world making clear to these countries that this, in the end, wasn't in their long-term best interest, that what might look good or feel good today, a deal at a port, some cotton that comes out of Xinjiang, whatever it might have been, might be the best deal on the table for the moment, but the costs connected to that, the costs connected to the Chinese Communist Party's malign activity are enormous. And so I made this case to Israeli leadership. I made this case to leadership all across the world. I've made this case to American leadership, who too confronts this same challenge where the Chinese economy is deeply entangled in the American economy. In the end, the national security of the United States of America ought to be paramount. Our responsibility is to make sure that we get this right for the American people. And so the idea that somehow we get a free ride by taking cheap Chinese goods into the United States or into another country around the world, or permit the Chinese to be inside our telecommunication systems, those are things that are, in my judgment, unacceptable from a national security perspective. And so every country, including Israel, needs to be mindful of that. That's how I made the case. I made it to the leadership. We made some progress. There is an awful lot more work to do, and Israel needs to be part of the global coalition that understands the threat that the Chinese Communist Party poses to its own people and to the world.
You planning on running for president?
Long ways off. I'm going to stay in the fight. The things that I worked on that you described during this interview, I care about deeply. I'm going to stay hard at them. We'll see what the world brings in 2022 and beyond.
Former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, thank you so much for taking the time to join us. We really do appreciate it.
Thank you, sir. Have a good day.